Everyone, everyone ready for some group editing? Now, so thank you, Nettie, Dan, Marshall, Peter, for stepping up and helping to edit the document. So what they've done, what we've done so far is essentially just to take Laura's document and Eric's document and merge them together and sort of align by topics, correct?
Yes.
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 So they've not done any sort of substantive editing, no judgments.
That's what Eric is doing now. Eric is going, I understand Eric is making a shareable view-only version of the document, which he will share. And we have one editor for the document, which is currently that desktop at the front. So we're in a one editor only, two editors, Eric and the desktop.
How about adding the ability to comment?
I thought that's what we're here standing in the room to do.
Well, rather than commenting simultaneously on a document, let's try and be organized about this, and so try and establish some order around the editing of the document. I'm really not good at talking and typing at the same time.
And I'm not good at running and typing at the same time, but we can...
Dan, so can you hop up here? Thank you. Okay. So, it's...
Oh, you can make it bigger now. Yeah, we'll go back to the... I think
so it's 3:10. I think in an hour and a half we might be able to maybe settle on some things. What I was thinking of in like the next hour and a half, thereabouts, try and finish and narrow down and get to some agreement on principles. If we're not able, I think we've made significant progress, even if we don't absolutely finish this at the end of the day. I think we've made a tremendous amount of progress. I would like to finish this today, but I'd also like not to be here until 9 o'clock finishing it. If we kind of reach the end of all of our energy and time and people are starting to leave, what I was thinking we might do is, and I think this might be a useful exercise even if we have finished this, organize another webinar conversation with everybody to say, give a couple weeks of time to sit and ponder this agreement principles, have a webinar, here's the final document, anybody have any final thoughts on it before we just hit send and tell the world that we've done it, and run forth with these principles. I think that might be a useful, it's been a long couple days after a long week. It might make a sense to have that kind of revisiting opportunity.
Andrew.
Yeah.
What I was going to say too, I'm trying to be my organization's representative to this group, but I would like to be able to share this with, our security officer, our privacy officer, to make sure that these are the kinds of things that make sense. If you're looking for an endorsement at the end of the day from organizations.
Actually what I'm thinking we will do, rather than, I think we can agree on principles together and then set up a kind of endorsement page that if your after we've established the principles, if your I think we'd like to set up a process by which your OCLC could say they endorse these principles, and maybe have some, wiki comments, features about it, as a follow-up, but I don't think we necessarily want to have all of you go back to your organizations and clear this by your council and say, okay, before we can agree on our principles, it needs to be vetted. Oh, no, no, no. Like, yeah, that's also not, yeah, sorry. That was, we've got your DNA from your coffee cup, so, you know, obviously, maybe this goes without saying, but I should say it anyway. Simply by participating in this room, you're invited experts. This doesn't imply that anyone's organizations is obligated by these principles. This is a gentleman's agreement, gentleperson's agreement. We don't necessarily, this is not a formally adopted kind of thing. These are a set of principles. Hopefully we'll get people to buy into them and agree to them, but simply by your presence and your help in drafting these things doesn't imply any formal approval by anyone's organizations. Legal disclaimer. So in addition to that, I was thinking also the steering committee might make sense for the steering committee to have another meeting once the principles are finalized to talk about next steps in terms of adoption and endorsements and all of that other stuff. I think it'd be useful for the steering committee to get together again, maybe once or twice. I think there's 3 proposals out that I believe at least 2 of them have been accepted for me to talk about this in the fall, just as an FYI. And I think there's a few other opportunities throughout the fall where I will be talking about these principles, presuming we get to the point of agreement on them. So those are kind of, in an ideal world, next steps. So we've got about an hour and a half, thereabouts. So let's take this away. Overall theme. This is, I'm going to stop trying to make a distinguishing between who's contributed to this document because it's already, you know, I think we're past that. Overall, principle, first serve the user. Patron.
Here.
Can we also, out of the governing principles of one of the documents, I won't say whose, can we have...
There was a sentence or two.
Yeah, the all parties are, I mean, I know that we were trying to simplify the language, but that concept that everybody can be on either side of, the way it was put, all parties are intermediaries for some data and subjects for some data, so that idea that...
I thought I did put it in there, but it may be in a different section.
Okay. I think it would be a good one to have
In the beginning.
Yeah.
Here, Mike.
Here, I can run around. Or, no, sorry.
There was a phrase that Eric used about libraries and providers working together to create an environment of privacy. I'm misquoting a little bit. That should be kind of, to me, that's kind of a, I don't remember where it was. So.
I might not have, I'm thinking maybe I...
That was under responsibilities, yeah.
It was something like,
Yeah, that.
yeah, I think that's would be a nice lead off.
Here, Mike.
And I don't know if you need the first one if you have that one.
I think it's best. I think that what you left is more important for the document. And while I like the other one, obviously, I think it's stronger. I mean, less is more in this case.
And the other one was around the intermediaries?
Just that concept of being, you can be on either side of the...
Yeah, I may have saved that for later and then not come back to grab it.
Okay. Can I add a note here?
So that's at the beginning of Flora's document, right? Yeah, I think I said, oh, that's very nice, and we need to go back.
It would be really wonderful as an overall theme to have something that just as a very basic matter talked about why privacy is such an important issue for libraries as opposed to other everybody else. And so I'd really love to see something in one of the first words be, intellectual freedom, and that that libraries show privacy is especially important issue for libraries because it's so inherently connected to the intellectual privacy and intellectual freedom of their patrons.
And you could look to the first paragraph of the ebook vendor privacy document I brought with me today, which states
ALA Code of Ethics.
that's less specific to the issue of privacy, though, I would think.
Yeah, let's do this. We'll take an action to add in on why privacy. I would also like to renew my desire for having some sort of statement that there exists a set of business metrics, data about the library use that we should feel empowered to make use of in a respectful and proper way that respects privacy as much as we can. But I do like that as the, one of the ideas in the first principle is student data principles, that there is value to help us be better libraries if we are able to look at the services that we provide and how we're meeting patron needs.
This is Bobby. Oh. I just was going to read this first paragraph that Barbara mentioned for the record, I guess, and for the people who might be watching.
It's Deborah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Please feel free to chastise me publicly later. I just want to read this first paragraph for the record, I guess, and I'm not sure everybody watching or later will have access to this document. So the introduction, the first paragraph, back to David's point, says that protecting user privacy and confidentiality has long been an integral part of the intellectual freedom mission of libraries. The right to free inquiry, as assured by the First Amendment, depends on the ability to read and access information free from scrutiny by the government or other third parties. In their provision of services to library users, librarians have an ethical obligation expressed in the ALA Code of Ethics to preserve users' right to privacy and to prevent any unauthorized use of patron data. Librarians and libraries may also have a legal obligation to protect library user data from unauthorized disclosure.
Here. Can you read this?
Well,
I have the text. I can paste it into a Google Doc if you'd like.
There's a draft on the web, is that current?
No, it's not.
That first paragraph,
Yeah, the first paragraph.
Yeah, the first paragraph.
You'll paste that in there?
I'm,
We won't even require attribution.
no. My concern with that is it is a very library-focused statement, and it is not as inclusive of the different voices that are represented here in the room. So I don't disagree with the sentiment, but I think the text of this document shouldn't be, it's a useful background, but I don't know that copying and pasting it into this document would serve the purposes that we're trying to achieve.
How about take the first sentence and modify it?
Yeah.
Don't put the whole paragraph in. So protecting user privacy and confidentiality has long been an integral part of the intellectual freedom mission of libraries.
And yeah, and as,
I mean,
yeah,
tone down a little bit of the But get the IF.
Get the idea. I mean, I absolutely, yeah. My point is not to object to the idea. My point is to expand it to include the publishers and the information providers and the systems vendors who...
All participants in the library ecosystem.
Yes.
I mean, tying that, this is Laura, tying that to the First Amendment traditional protections for, you know, consumption of information and access to information, anonymous speech and so forth. I mean, so bringing it to First Amendment and I guess to the extent that we're international, you know, the Declaration of Rights, I mean, tying it to those broad principles and then saying, you know, as libraries have traditionally recognized, and then bringing in the library piece that brings the library piece in and also situates it in this broader context.
The publishing community has also been very staunch supporters.
That's right. That's right. That's why I'm saying if you put up the First Amendment and all the rest of it, then like everybody can feel like they're at home, I hope.
And I do note that the beauty that is encapsulated in this first paragraph here does not in any way, shape, or form say that we can't make use of the data ourselves to inform our business decisions. And despite having brought this up a couple of times, and despite others in this room having expressed a very sincere and desirable, you know, to use this, it has yet to make it to the screen. And I'm wondering if we could either put that element on the screen or have a conversation as to why it's not being added to the screen. The concept that nothing in this first paragraph, nothing that we're saying out of all of this respect for user privacy, there's nothing in this first paragraph that says libraries can't make informed decisions based on things that are happening in libraries. That we can or can't? Why do we have to put in this? Because I believe that some of these statements that come out like this have had a chilling effect on the practice of making informed decisions within libraries out of the fear of going too far towards compromising patron privacy. I believe that that has and could be easily demonstrated through review of literature and a review of practices and sentiments by librarians in the field. And I with huge respect for everything encapsulated in this first paragraph, I would also like a statement that says we can, as libraries, look at what is happening in our libraries and look at what our patrons are doing and use that data to better inform our business practices as libraries. Not disclose the information, not give the information to anybody, but use it to help us be better libraries. And I would like to see that added.
I move that we bracket that and hold that, you know, make a note and see if that concern is adequately addressed by, you know, the instances of the fact that we're talking about using data throughout the thing, throughout the document. We're talking about ways to use the data. I mean, the reason that I would suggest just bracketing it and not putting it in right away is because making a positive assertion of that is like yet another positive assertion that then demands further explanation. And I would suggest that the explanation is actually like embedded in the document itself. But taking your concern very seriously, let's note it and see if we feel that it's adequately addressed later on. And I apologize because I know I cut a couple of people off here.
No. I was just thinking that, well, we need some kind of paragraph or essay that introduces this. There may be verbiage from the original proposal, or maybe something like that, but to try to kind of compose that framing now, I think it's going to be pretty time consuming.
I'll speak louder. I agree. This is an item that will benefit from us taking offline out as a summary after we've come through everything, creating an offline summary and then sending it out for comment.
There are a lot of things that I'm very proud of in being a member of the library profession. Service orientation, openness, transparency, neutrality, et cetera. One thing I would not be very proud of is if this document wound up by dint of explicit statement or implication saying that the library profession has decided it basically wants to be the only profession that consciously and deliberately ignores and throws away information
that could be used to determine its success, to evaluate its impact. I was talking to Mike about this earlier. Just about every major academic institution has hired an assessment librarian in the last 10 years. And you can't do assessment without data. So I just want to be sure, I mean, you can bracket it for now, but I want to be sure in the end that it's abundantly clear that we're not suggesting that, you know, either, again, by just not saying it anywhere or not providing a counterpoint, that for the sake of patron privacy, everything is going to be to that side, and that's it.
Perhaps the simple statement that we just took out a few minutes ago could go back in to you know, address some of these tone concerns that you know, first serve the users. Just to throwing that out as a suggestion.
Gary, did you?
The transparency section. A library should be able to know what information is generated and so on. Could we put something in there about in a timely manner? Are there any, for example, are there any tests going on? Are you testing something with adding a cookie or something like that? Can we be notified? Can libraries be notified of those types of things going on in a timely manner? That type of thing. That's something we could put in brackets, Lori.
I'm just objecting to the use of the word knowledge.
Why didn't use it?
No, I'm
this
totally
the-
with Gary's suggestion, and
Did
then
we
I was
just-
just adding on.
Okay.
Where are we in the document?
Should be
Okay,
information
all
or
right. No,
data,
that's
right?
fine. I'm just, you keep bouncing around, I don't know exactly where the. That's fine, okay. Okay.
Can we use data instead of knowledge?
No.
How about information instead of knowledge? What's the deal with knowledge?
Actually, yeah, knowledge, that's not a really appropriate use of that word.
Well, if I know someone, if I know a woman is pregnant, well, right, that may be something that I can deduce from the data, right? And it makes no sense to restrict the data without restricting the knowledge.
So now you want to... So you want to get back everything that has been deduced from the data also? Is that what you're, by using knowledge? I mean, that's a pretty big statement.
First bullet, second line.
Oh, I see. Yeah, you're right.
Therefore, we would need to we would need to modify it in the second bullet as well, then, please.
That's all right. Sorry, live stream people.
And in the second bullet, knowledge to data.
It's just a lot of wordsmithing at this point.
I think you can take those brackets off.
Yes.
I'm not sure what document that their bullet came from, and I'm sure that there was no intent, but just to make sure that there's no later concern about plagiarism, it should be noted that that is a basically word-for-word copy-paste from the student data principles. just that libraries got changed to student data instead of, or library data instead of student. But otherwise, it is exactly from the, just.
To make a friendly amendment or reframe that, it would be generally more compelling in the document if when it is presented later, and I think this is offline, that the rationale includes the sets of principles upon which it based and the other expressions of those on which it relied.
So just to be clear, what you're suggesting is like a reference list. In a source document, these are
Bibliography.
Principles upon which this has been based or drafted, or
More of a rationale. Okay. Right, that these are already widely accepted principles. They have been articulated in various forms here.
Okay.
And,
and a sort of
a reference list or footnotes.
introduction to.
That's all right.
Wait for the editor first. In the transparency section, we talk about making it clearly available to the library what's going on and clearly available about the data retentions. Let's add some clearer, the ideas of clarity and understandability to the first point for the patrons as well. So if the patron, if we're going to, the other 2 points talk about that, so we should probably add similar language to the first point. So it says, oh, maybe the second one doesn't say it anymore. I thought it did. Clear and publicly available. So I think the idea of clarity needs to be in the first point. When we notify the patron, in the transparency part, we're notifying the patron about what's going on. We talked about not overwhelming them. We probably want to get the idea of simplicity and clarity across.
Yeah, just on that third point under transparency, do we really need to say including researchers there? Are we really going to give that private library data to researchers?
If we're really talking about using this for a business metric sense, we might. And I don't like the limitation of service providers to contracted service providers. Like, if there's a service provider that you don't have a contract with, they're allowed to do anything they want? Sorry, no.
Yeah. You might not have a contract with Google. You have a terms of service, it's not a contract.
In regards to researchers, are we talking about personally identifiable information about patrons? Because I would raise concerns about that, not without the explicit consent of the library patron.
The notion is that if researchers are using it for something, they need to present clearly back to the person who is the subject of that data how it's being used. This is the direction toward the user.
Yeah, okay.
The point being, this was copy and pasted from student data principles.
And I would, to the extent,
That's where it's coming from.
would, as a library, if I were a public library user and I found out the library was sharing my personally identifiable use of the library with a researcher without obtaining my explicit prior consent, I would be deeply upset about that. Yeah, that's just something we're not going to do. Researchers shouldn't have access to that data unless they go through an IRB and they make a case and they get consent of the user.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was going to say is, I mean, is it worth specifying that any use of this data outside of internal library purposes should be subject to IRB, human subject review?
IRB is useful. I mean, this is a complete conflation of transparency, which usually means transparency to the user of what their data is being, collected, how it's being used, how long it's going to be retained, and so forth. And now apparently turning that data into open access and transparent to the world, that's something completely different. That's a use of data, and that needs to be specially flagged. IRB, state laws, privacy, there's a million things wrong with that. So I will tamp down my outrage now.
Well, yeah.
So is there something to add here or not? No, it was in there because it was.
The phrase including researchers was in there because the principal statement was copied and pasted from the student data principles, where in terms of student data being educational records, it would be an appropriate and fully allowable use of the data as part of educational research that would go through all of the requirements of IRB and everything else.
Well,
for student data in a school data.
And maybe that explains
that's why it showed up there.
And
that's
maybe
why,
that explains why we shouldn't cut and paste from other privacy principles, and we need to actually develop something that's specific to the library context, which can apply to other kinds of places. Because here we need to analyze what data we're collecting, and then why it's being collected, and then use the transparency principle, which means transparency to the user. And if we're going to now envision this entirely new third-party category of researchers with access to the data, then that is just a whole different, like outside of the chain of custody, a whole new thing. Like that's just, please strike it, just strike it.
It's gone.
I'm just trying to explain that's why it showed up there.
Okay, it's gone. Let's move on. Let's move on. Okay. Now, this section focuses on transparency in the chain of custody and issues surrounding.
Principle 10 can just become a bullet under the transparency categories. The idea that it should be transparent via system design, if not, right?
Would we need, or do we need to define some of these terms?
Yes.
Okay. Can you just put up in the top, put up at the top?
Action, define.
Action.
No, I think it's under transparency, right?
Define. No, what I'm thinking is there's a variety of terms in this document that, like, I think have been highlighted, are all caps in sort of contractual language style. That they need some terms and definitions, and we don't need to go through them all right now, but I know that we should highlight them.
Just a question on this. Aside from needing to define some of these words, I'm not sure I know what you mean by intermediary. So in this context, what is meant by intermediaries? Collection of data should be transparent to the subject and to intermediaries. And who are these? Which of the many possible intermediaries are the intermediaries we're talking about?
I think I was adapting something that Lori had suggested, but I mean, collection of data by any entity should be transparent to the subject, right? And then I think the question is, intermediaries are, they're the people who are, the entities that are collecting the data, the entities about whom the data is being collected, right? And then other people that might, other entities that might have access to it are the intermediaries, right? So the libraries might be the intermediaries through whom information is flowing from the patron to a vendor, right? And in that case, I said that there are some questions. Lori raised that as an idea, and I said, I think we should have that up there as a discussion, like what is appropriate and what isn't, and it might need its own cabining of safety precautions, but put it up there. So that's what I mean by intermediaries, the people who are collecting, the people about whom are being collected, and the folks in between.
Again, was anyone or anything through which data flows between the source and the user patron? Could or close enough?
Well, I think of the source as the
source is the user.
patron, but
yeah,
between the
data
data provider maybe or the.
Could you give a concrete example?
Sure, I can try to come up with a concrete example. So for instance, a user puts in a user ID and a search query into LexisNexis, which is being validated through a proxy server at the library. So the library has it, the IT department runs the proxy server, which validates off of a library server for some other piece of data, and then it goes over to LexisNexis. So the library and the IT department are the intermediaries. LexisNexis is the collector. The user is the subject.
The part that I was most interested in, and you can wordsmith the subject intermediary business later, is that idea that it should be obvious, built into the design, it should be obvious to the user, whoever that user is, that data is being collected. That was the thing that I wanted to add as a bullet point under transparency. And if not by design, then by notice.
Yeah, that was a key part that came out of discussions that we had, so it's obvious if you're putting in a search term that information is being collected. It's obvious if you've put in your name and now it's recognizing you by name. That's built into the system, so it's flagging it for the user. Other information like IP address, keystroke logging, whatever, like that's not obvious to the user, and so that needs separate notification. So that key distinction.
So in the particular example, the concrete example you gave, the library's proxy server is the intermediary? Am I hearing that correct?
Yeah, the library and IT department, sure.
Right, and so the transparency in that case that you're asking for is that somehow there's a notice on the library site saying we use a proxy server and we keep logs?
I'm going to turn this over to the person in the back with this plaid arm raising.
I'm actually going to propose, it seems to me we're confusing ideas of data access, and we're getting into the weeds of who should access the data with transparency. So maybe in the interest of time, we move down and talk about our data access model, then we can come back to transparency and see what we want to tell the user about after we know what our data access model looks like.
Because I didn't have that under, in my little spreadsheet, like, I don't think these were organized in the same fashion.
Right.
So I think it can get a little confused.
Yeah, we moved things around.
Yeah, okay. So, well,
Okay,
so you put that, I think we already said that. That's in there, right?
That's what transparency is, yeah.
so
A library patron should be able to clearly know what the library has collected about them and who may access that data.
See, not just the library, what information has been collected. Not just the library, what data has been collected about them by any entity in that information chain.
So that's the first and the second line. The second line, sorry, the second line there talks about vendors and publishers. The first line talks about the library. So I'm
wondering if we can capture this notion of the chain in simpler language by saying what information has been collected about them by the library and others as a result of use of library services and resources.
That looks good. I like that.
But
I like that.
Thoughts, first bullet,
The point of the second bullet is to state that the library should have similar levels of access to data.
Right.
And so the second bullet remains, I think, a critical point based on the conversation that's taken place.
Yeah, so there's transparency to the user, and then there's transparency to the library.
Right.
So that the library is aware of third or fourth party sharing.
And of that, then, this bullet point is no longer needed.
I think that the bullet point below, I think the bullet point below may express the underlying intent of the bullet above, the currently highlighted bullet, that the bullet below seems to express that intent in a way that may be a little more clear, perhaps?
Lori, does that meet your initial?
Sorry, I tuned out for a minute. I was just practicing breathing.
Sorry, Lori brought this one up initially, right?
Yes, that works for me.
Does this works for you if we get rid of this? Okay.
Oh, if we get rid of that? I guess, I'm having a little bit of an issue with everything seems to be kind of all about the user, whereas I think in the model that Laura had created a model that dealt with a more complicated relationship of users and the library and the service providers, and this document is all about the user.
No.
These are pasted in directly from the other document.
Right. But I thought you just said you were going to delete that one.
No, but it's captured in the second.
This update here.
Okay.
About the library.
Okay.
Also in lieu of the bullet directly below the previously highlighted bullet, where it states that it should be obvious to user via system design or otherwise by notice that data is being collected, I think is a more plain English statement of the collection of data should be transparent to the subject and to intermediaries. The only difference would be it should be obvious to the user and everybody else, to everybody, the library, the user, everybody that data is being collected.
Yeah.
Would
so
be the only
out-
difference between the two bullets.
Yeah, that's good. Take out to user.
But I think that does need to be questioned. I'm not sure. I mean, I took what Lori's point was, and it's an important point to discuss, but I don't think we should accept it without discussion of whether collection of data about a user, by vendor X should also be transparent to the library. I think there's a lot in that should be considered. Maybe that's appropriate because it allows the library to engage in some policing and metricing of services. Maybe it's inappropriate because it's not necessary. So I mean, I think there are pros and cons and details. Like we put it in there, but we should discuss it.
I think we need to be transparent about our ignorance as well, and to claim that we know at every step of the way along the chain exactly who has access and what kind of access they have, and we shouldn't be making promises we can't keep, basically. And I don't know that we can guarantee that we know where there are places where users' data might be siphoned off. A recent example, when the library was looking into the e-resource use data at the college level, we just started poking around and asking our central IT folks what they had, and we learned about a system we had no idea even existed at basically the edge of the network between the LAN and WAN. They were basically sniffing every single packet, IP address, and URL. There's just so many levels and layers in this.
Well, simply because there's opportunities, I'd say, where things are happening that you don't know about, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a principle, and a principle towards understanding that relationship and that data exchange. And simply because there are things that you might not be aware of, that doesn't make you at fault.
I'm just saying we shouldn't be claiming we are being 100% transparent. We just can't know.
And I don't think we're doing I think it's important to distinguish between policy statement and visions and principles, and principles are more visionary than they are policy statements.
Yes. I want to go back to the first two bullet points. The first one is missing part of what is included in the second, and that is how that data is used, which was very important when we were crafting this. It says a library user should be able to know how the library and its suppliers have know what the library and its suppliers have collected about them, who may access that data as a result of the library services, and how that data is being used. Yeah, thank you.
I'll clarify that I was not actually tackling the issue that you mentioned. What I meant to say in this here is the second bullet should probably say a library should be able to know what information is generated, collected, stored by vendors about that library, is what I was getting at, not about the user.
Yeah. So that's why I think it's useful to actually talk about these different layers, like entities, about these information. That's why I think it's useful to talk about the fact. That's why I think it's useful to talk about the fact that we're all collecting data about each other, right, and recognize that these principles can apply in all ways, in part because, you know, all those pieces of information can ultimately redound to the, you know, affect the individual human end user, right, and then separately flag that that person is particularly important and whose needs are particularly vulnerable, right, and really should be considered the model use study, but like at least recognize that we're all doing those things, right?
That's why the word subject is more comfortable to me. Using the word subject applies sometimes to the library, sometimes it applies to the end user, depending on what data has been collected.
Yeah, it's boring jargon, you know, and kind of dehumanizing, but it's, so it's not as fun, but I think it captures more fluidity.
Or the other option is to simply remove the reference altogether and simply say that it should be obvious via system design or otherwise by notice that data is being collected, and not specify to whom it should be obvious, just simply verify in a principle that it should be obvious. You know, I think later on there were some statements, you know, about benefit, and if we, you know, we can say benefit to the user or library, or we can just say it should be justified or it should be of benefit. And sometimes by not attempting to list every use scenario or every person, we don't have to run the risk as much of leaving someone out, in a broad principle statement at least.
So that's
Maybe we need guidance from you about what level you want this stuff at. I feel like that's one of the things we're getting tripped up about.
what do you mean by what? At what level? Like, are we talking at the library management level? Are we talking at the?
What do you want to end up with these statements? Do you want something that's kind of aspirational goals in kind of very broad terms, or
more aspirational broad goals than
nitty-gritty details?
Well, because I expect that we will come back to these principles and flesh out the principles with more robust explanations and more robust use cases, et cetera, that apply to these statements.
So the principle might be, it should be obvious.
Yes.
I don't think it should be obvious. I think it should
So,
be clear.
It should, it can.
Well, that's a word choice.
I'm wondering.
That's a word choice perhaps between clear and obvious, and I don't want to get to that level. What I was saying is perhaps rather than attempting to specify to whom it should be clear or obvious and attempting to, within the principle statement, declare everyone to whom it should be clear or obvious, just to simply state at a higher and broader level that it should be clear or it should be obvious.
Mike?
I'm just wondering if we can go to an outline form to drop narrative concerns and try to, maybe we can't, because if we just do an outline form, we don't know what we mean. But we're dangerously, well, I've been on many academic committees, and while we're not to the level of grammar syntax, we're really close. We're really close. So I'm just, in the sake of time, I'm wondering if there's a way for, I like the discussion around the principles, but I'm wondering if we can get to the core of the matter without worrying about the wording quite as much. And maybe we can't.
I think the core of the matter is clarity, a notice, and a clear notice to the community that data is being collected, stored, and analyzed. And that there should be some communication to that effect.
And so take out the word user and the word library in this sentence, we have that statement.
Well, so I think that real library users want the library to sort of do the privacy job for them, and they want to be able to trust the library to make choices that protect them on their behalf and not have to worry about seeing everything that they're doing.
But by stripping out user from that statement, that could be, the library could be the person that's aware of, you know, the librarian could be the one that's aware of the tracking.
The library needs...
Any referential noun from that statement, you simply state that it should be overall obvious and clear.
Is that?
To anybody and everybody.
So in the interest of moving forward, maybe we can just open the document to commenting. So we start capturing some of the back and forth and the wordsmithing in the comments, and then...
Oops, sorry, Mike.
That's just a suggestion.
I'd like that too, but I'd like to see it, maybe the steering committee get it nice and tight, because we talked a while ago about not turning this into a manifesto, and I'm worrying if it's commenting, that's one thing, but if there's sort of a group editing thing, I worry about it crossing the line from principles into long manifesto.
Sure.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that we can take and I'd like to see us go through at a broad level each of these principles, make sure that we're all still, get this similar level of commentary, but not necessarily to the same level of granular detail, and then have an editing session, then bring that back to the group. I think that's the only way we're going to get through the level of content in the time we have today.
Yes. Like we can, as I said, we can circle back with the group in, you know, a week or couple weeks and say, oh, here's the themes and the kind of broad principles that we agreed. Now let's hammer through some language that describes those. But the, you know, I think the core of those, the thread of this conversation in the last 10 minutes has been, we want to acknowledge to the community that there is data gathering going on, and there's an analytics that's going to take place, and there should be some clear communication about that. That's the, you know, the crux of this, and how it gets wordsmithed, we don't necessarily have to spend 45 minutes doing.
Would it be useful to divide up into smaller groups and examine individual parts in groups?
I see one person shaking.
Huh?
I don't know, is it a question?
Or should we just
Is it
plow
practical
through?
at this point?
Let's plow through.
Let's just plow through?
Yeah.
Yes.
We could set a timer and give ourselves 2 minutes per principle and then just move on.
I got my watch.
iPhone.
There we go. Okay, so lightning round.
Say 3 minutes too.
3 minutes. Go.
Immune to eavesdropping seems to be a bit of a loaded statement that may have some additional baggage with it, and also may over-deliver a promise. Perhaps it could be a little more neutral in saying that are, secure to industry standards, or, that meet best practices for security, just to state without any potential hidden bias.
I mean, that seems to make sense to me. Because immune to eavesdropping is probably unrealistic.
I disagree. No. No. I mean, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about immunity to eavesdropping. And it may be loaded, but it's intentionally loaded. We don't want people eavesdropping on the communications between a library and the people who are using it.
Wait, just Micah.
Micah, and then I saw Marshall.
If
Go
ahead, Micah.
If we have only 2 minutes, I say I like Principle 7 and the annotations there, and would strike the rest as both overlapping, vague, and confusing.
Just keep Principle 7. Well, maintained and transmitted.
I would amend that. It says transmitted lower, but it doesn't.
Yeah. I also want to, Deb reminded me of something that we'd earlier said, which is the principle of continual improvement, which means, continually reassessing and seeing if technologies have improved or if circumstances have changed, thus rendering the data more vulnerable or whatever, but that continual improvement and continual assessment is there.
We have that in the responsibility section. It's called out there right now.
Marshall's next.
I want to advocate in favor of encrypting data streams, because this is something that is specific to library concerns for privacy that is not necessarily mandated by industry standards in the transmission of web information. So, I mean, there's industry standards to support that, but I don't think that general IT industry mandates encryption of web streams. Both API, either API or through visual user interfaces, sure.
There's 3 minutes.
So there's...
The notion of taking this bottom section.
Perhaps to Marshall's comment, we could say insecure and encrypted. If we really want to highlight encryption as a desirable.
I strongly feel that these are the points that I'm most attached to, obviously, and I think that the 3 bullet points are much better written and stronger and accurate than as it's written in Principle 7. I think there's a lot wrong with Principle 7. We can have a long discussion about it. And I'd be happy to have that discussion.
Sort of.
I think this is early. That's a lot of narrative. And so I'm curious that we settle on principles and not worry about narrative. So as far as I'm concerned, those 2 paragraphs are almost, those 2 sections are almost identical. The bottom one is just stripped of some flowery language.
I would suggest possibly the principle 7 is the statement, and we can wordsmith it. And the 3 things that are underneath it, no, I'm not suggesting they be cut. I'm suggesting that they may be like, be kind of more detail that go along with the principle. that flesh out the principle in specific detail. And so not cut them, but move them down as far as statements associated with the principle. Does that acceptable, Eric? I mean, understanding that you want something more stringent.
So may I, since I have the mic, may I offer a friendly amendment? I'm willing to, if you want to kibitz together, I'm willing to work on those and put them in sort of standard information security form. Right now, they're in a, they're detailed without being really clear conceptually, but we can map them to particular security properties that we want and make them more biting than the OECD ones without invoking an entirely new vocabulary of stuff.
I object to talking about data rather than services. I object to, so integrity is important, but it applies differently to transmission and storage, for example. There are implications on integrity and storage that, in terms of long-term storage that maybe we don't intend here. The HTTPS, I mean, the reason you use HTTPS is to avoid surveillance. And the object is to avoid surveillance. The object is not to maintain encrypted data. Okay? So I'm saying that we want to, the principle should be what we want to accomplish, not necessarily how to accomplish it. And we shouldn't confuse the how and the what.
Oh, sorry.
I think when encryption is replaced by something else for securing data from eavesdropping, I'm willing to revise the document.
Is there anything significant in terms of principles missing here? Because if it's just a matter of these are somewhat different takes on the same basic principles, maybe we can agree that this will be worked out by the steering committee and move on to the next issue.
Any objections to that?
For example, just as an example, passwords are not data. Okay?
I agree we should move on. I think that kind of statement we can discuss forever, and many of these kinds of statements we can, and I think that our limited time here would be best served by moving through the rest of the principles and getting some broad consensus.
Well, I mean, we could include a statement here about what we mean by data, we mean as broad as possible, because in the context of what we are talking about, from my perspective, I would say passwords are data that are critical elements in functioning in the functioning of these systems, and can be.
And can be tied to individuals, but that goes into the definitions, right? Like, what is data versus, should we choose to use knowledge, which I would never want to use knowledge, but maybe there's a case to be made for it. But like, all that is definitions. So I would really move second, I think Richard's motion, that we move to the next principle.
Okay.
Do you want to set 3 minutes?
Yeah, because we're sticking.
We did so well with that the last
We're sticking so closely to the 3 minutes, but should we make it 5? We're going to extend the day.
This one has a lot of
All right, I'm moving it to 4 minutes,
That's the big one.
because we can compromise. Okay.
Christopher.
I think I made some of those changes that are up there in red, so I guess I better kick it off here and say this is another case, I think, where if we are going to state the user, I would like to see that be broadened to also respect the needs of large classes of users, of the library itself in a managerial sense, and other things beyond that. I don't want us to place too much emphasis on the needs of a single user if doing something may have a larger benefit as well. And so might it be possible to just, in this sentence, at the word justified, period, collection of information should be justified in some sense, in some way that can be described in additional statements, but you shouldn't do it willy-nilly, it should be justified. And then in the additional bullets, must always be considered against its actual benefit, period. That if we can't, if benefit doesn't matter to whom, there should be a benefit, risk-benefit analysis undertaken. And no matter who the subject is, there should be a risk-benefit analysis. And to not spell out every single possible subject or a user, users, patrons, whatever, just to add those periods and then let that be described later on.
You gonna say something? No. Okay. You look from the back, you look like you were.
I guess if nobody else is going to respond, I will. I feel like that was part of our hash out over here. And you can justify just about anything. So I think the reason we wanted user left in was that focus on the patron's privacy from the patron perspective, as opposed to, really, if all you're saying is justified, you can just find data collection you want, do anything with it you want. So, maybe we need to change the wording of that a little bit, but I hate to just stop at justified.
Justified to the subject of data collection, is that sufficient, with special attention to individual user concerns? Would that capture, Bobby, would that capture what we were discussing? Yeah.
For me, this is just, a lot of this goes back to what I brought up as a desire for an overall statement, expressing that libraries have, I believe, a right to use data internally to inform our business decisions, our library decisions, be they acquisitions, programming, whatever, and that, it may, I don't feel like I should have to justify to a senior user why I want to do programming for youth. That, when we say the individual user, there may not be a full recognition of the library's place within this data collection. With full respect for everything in privacy in that lovely first paragraph, again, it doesn't say libraries shouldn't be doing.
I would just go back to the suggestion I made earlier to maybe phrase this in terms of important library purposes or legitimate library purposes or compelling library purposes, however you want to set that standard, but just to make sure that you're excluding, you are explicitly excluding things that are not, that are tangential to the functioning of the library, or maybe even non-central to the functioning of the library.
Or that cannot be justified.
Eric? Okay.
Under principle 6, it's where it says retention analysis should be limited based on utility and justification disclosed to and consented by the subject. It seems to imply that any data retention, that the subjects are empowered to opt out of any form of data retention. And in the context of what we were just discussing, I think that's too absolutist, that there's going to be some data that the subject cannot opt out of the retention of.
For value-added services or for opt-in services?
I mean, again, it could be basic library operations. I mean, this is
the option to approve it. The option to approve it could be then limited to that scope of above-the-line items that are in that matrix that we put together earlier of the tiers. There's things that were just part of library function and had no opt-out capability, and then but things that were opt-inable can be opt-outable. I think that you have the right to say, I do not want to be part of this group.
I'm just saying there should be a distinction, and some data should be considered, and the retention of some data should be considered not opt-outable of, and that's not covered here.
Well, it seems to me we just blew through the supporting anonymous use principle that we had up on the wall here then.
The way we phrased it in our document, the way we approached it was basically the user had the right to opt into things that provided extra services or extra personalization. So we didn't actually explicitly state, we basically said the user's had an option if they want extra, for personalization. Sorry, it's getting end of a long day. So the opt-in feature was around personalization data and features. So the baseline data would be collected. I mean, it is going to be collected.
But not necessarily attributable.
Right.
So what does that mean under supporting anonymous use?
Well, in an ideal library, you would have some form of anonymous use. So if you take the print world as an example, barring Eric's zero knowledge checkout system, you're able to go in the library and access it anonymously, a book in the library. But in order to use the book at home, you in essence opt in for some personal data to be collected by you when you check out.
I think there might be a principle that states that, some level of library service may be able to be undertaken at a certain level of anonymity, but if it involves digital information in networks, that greatly increases the risk of the use being non-anonymous, just because there are so many things outside of the library's control.
There was something in here to that nature.
Yeah, I think there was some statement that, there is a desire to support as much anonymous use as possible, but the user needs to have an understanding that certain value-added services and especially certain digital interactions may reduce anonymous possibilities.
So we start with...
Give him a mic.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so if we start with the notion that there is a need by some library users to be anonymous and should provide accordingly, and two, not all enhancements will be available to anonymous users, and using some services will inherently bring with them trackability or data retention.
So how do these two things
To the extent that the point is that electronic data is inherently less secure than print or other forms of data, I'm okay with something like that. I'm not completely convinced, but like as a de facto matter right now, I'd say yes. As a point about that we should accept that or should encourage that, I would not want to encode that in a statement of principles. I would want to encode that we are, doing the best we can. We're trying to continually improve our practices, and we employ the best practices possible. And I'm going to take the microphone because unfortunately I have to leave, and I just wanted to make one point. The audit section, or whatever you want to call it, inventory, got included under accountability. And I can see why that would be the case, because audit is often referred to in this context of auditors or going back and double checking. When we were discussing it, what I meant by it was an initial inventory, if you will, like an initial survey, like a threat analysis, if you will, of practices. And that's where we were coming from. And so I think it's really important. I think a lot of the questions that we've been asking, well, who has this, who is it, all of those kinds of things are answered if you do that initial threat assessment and data flow analysis. And so I would urge us to not include that just in the accountability. I mean, third-party auditing, that kind of thing can be an accountability feature, but understanding the data flows as an analytic point seems to me to be critical to assessing anything with an eye towards privacy and security.
Thanks, Laura.
So, Marcia.
Ideally, I support anonymous use, but I also worry about promising something that may not actually be true. You may have this, okay, I'm going into anonymous mode, and from a certain level, the library is not tracking some things, but you can't give them false assurance that they could do something that they urgently needed to be private that you couldn't really deliver on. Or that when you say, I want to become anonymous, that it's going to somehow go and delete server logs and things like that ahead of normal rotation schedules and things like that. So yeah, I think these are good ideals, but let's not promise things that could damage someone if they relied on them.
Might we?
Well, I think we just, I think that's the crux of what we're getting to, because we're saying in the earlier data principle that we will collect some minimum to be defined, and with the collection of a minimum, there cannot be an anonymous. So I think those two are inherently in conflict.
So, to me, anonymous is like for electronic access to, say, a journal. The way our library is set up, you're able to come in and use a computer without having to log in to get to a whitelist of our resources, and we have IP recognition. So while technically it might be possible to figure out who was sitting at a computer at a given time, if they don't log in, if they just, the chances of them being identified is slim. If they're accessing it from their office where their IP address is, yes. If they go through our proxy server, yes. So those remote access don't have less anonymity than if they come in and use one of these terminals. And so I think libraries can attempt to provide anonymous access, but it won't be necessarily the full experience. Another example of where if you check out a book and it's not anonymous, but we leave it to the user to decide after the checkout if they want to keep a history of their checkout list. I mean, that's not quite about anonymity, but we have a scale here that we can apply. And while it's not possibly totally anonymous, we don't want to get in a situation, sometimes some of our products that we license, you have to log in to use. The eBrary, for example, let's pick on them. They can't, in our library, to get to the book, you can't actually access it in an anonymous manner. You have to log in with user credentials tied to our proxy server. So that is non-anonymous. Whereas some of our other ebooks, it doesn't matter, it's just IP recognition.
Well, I think the word anonymous has a particular meaning, and if we include it in the document as a theme that we're supporting anonymous use, we're going to have to be very careful with that word anonymous, and may not even use it.
As it currently stands, that section is pretty clear that it's talking about recognizing the need for some library users to be anonymous, basically, in some situations. It's not saying this is an absolute condition upon which all library services will be designed around. And I don't think it's practical or desirable, I mean, that's my personal opinion, to design all library services in that manner. But I think what Mike was just saying about offering opportunities that tend more toward anonymity is a form of supporting anonymous use. And this is not something to be applied across the board. And I don't think that's implied here either.
I think it seems to me that this is an aspirational goal, and there is both an acknowledgement of the desire for anonymous services and a recognition that that's not always a possibility. So this seems to me to be balanced in a way, and maybe there should be an additional point here about disclosure to the user, to the patron, about the potential issues with anonymity and anonymization, and that, you know, there are limitations to digital anonymity. You know, you're not as protected as you think you might be, but we can do our best.
I like what you said about it being an aspirational goal, that we will continue to work on this, and that we are, in the first statement, pledging to continue to work and to recognize that there is a desperate need and it is a critical function that we provide. Without promising that we can do it right now, we're stating that it's a desirable feature for some users at some times, and we are the ones, probably the only ones that are even thinking that we really want to provide it.
Okay, can we move on? I think there's some duplication in that section.
I think this would be a good candidate for offline.
Editing, yeah. Okay. Can we collaboratively edit a Google Doc offline?
Can we put something in the Principle 6 retention statement that indicates that the retention of all data is not subject to consent by the subject? There is some retention that they can't opt out of, or at least that's something to be refined and discussed.
honest, I'm just going to open up this can of worms again. I'll wait for a new form, because again, there is some data that cannot be opted out of by the patron, means that there is no anonymous use. And so let's wrestle with this offline and come back to it.
I just want to go home. Information needs is far too vague. I mean, you can claim anything as an information need, and it goes back to that same idea, you can justify anything. No, don't do that to me.
Where are you?
Right where you were. Libraries have information needs, give them the ability to meet those needs.
So we've education, UX.
That doesn't show up on ours, by the way.
Yeah, I think I have to refresh or something, maybe, I don't know.
Because it was entered as a suggestion to.
Oh, it hasn't been accepted?
Oh, okay.
So it doesn't, I mean, we can look at it on the screen, but it doesn't show up on our screen. Oh, okay.
Okay, well.
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to the opt-in, opt-out. I mean, this is the same argument I have about the justification. Libraries have information needs. That need could be anything, to track all your data all the time because we feel like it. So I think we've got to be really careful. And I know we're going to get down into the weeds with this, but, you know, I mean, you're giving, I'm sorry, a group of people who don't have a lot of belief in privacy a lot of wiggle room to justify their collection of data.
I apologize. I will fully confess that I added that statement as a reactionary and potentially snarky response to what I felt was an overall vagueness of the first statement that I felt placed too much weight on giving users the ability, and I felt perpetuated what I see as the chilling effect against libraries using data to inform their decisions. And as long as I can continue to stress that I feel very strongly that libraries are missing a huge opportunity to appropriately, legitimately, ethically, and everything else use data to inform our decisions to better meet patron needs, then by all means strike that. But I just want to make sure that's a sentiment that, with full respect for privacy, there is information that we can use internally, respecting privacy, to better our services.
I mean, that was included, I mean, we moved it up to the core principles, you know, the overview section. So there's, but there's,
Take it out, it's fine.
I mean, it seems duplicative to repeat it multiple places in the same document.
I guess I feel like I want to go on the record on audio with a comment or a concern that I've made over and over again online and in the conference calls, and that this room is not very diverse, and that, you know, this keeps going back to the same group of people making decisions about our privacy, and that tends to be hetero, white, middle-class men, and that they have different privacy concerns and needs than some of the rest of us do. And when you keep saying justification or need, the people who are making those decisions about that justification need are people with different concerns.
I'm on the record as a white male apologist, so I don't know what else I can do about that in this room. But I mean, I think, would it suffice, rather than having to sort of put a footnote of the library ALA Code of Ethics, that we say, you know, adhering to the library Code of Ethics, comma, or something like that? I mean, is that sufficient enough to sort of reference the work that's already been done in the Bill of Rights and the Code of Ethics without having to put them in parentheses here?
I mean, I would say that's not, but the only observation I'd make about that second statement that you admit is a snarky statement is that it has nothing to do with the patron's ability to opt in or opt out of whatever services or data.
It has everything to do with it.
But they should be able to, I mean, we should be able to discuss in a reasonable fashion the patron's ability to opt out in this section without elevating the library's needs above that. It's going to be dealt with in another area, or should be dealt with in another area, not in this section.
Well,
Yeah, what we're saying is you can opt out, but not really. When you say that your needs, the library's needs are elevated here.
Here's David.
I think we can't really talk intelligently about opt-in, opt-out unless we want to get into the weeds about that phrase a little more. What are we meaning? What's personally identifiable information there that a patron can opt in and opt out of? In some cases, we're talking about somebody checked out a book 20 times, therefore we need more. Are we going to delete that? Yes or no? I mean, there's a huge hole there that, you know, just what are the details of what that means that I don't think we can argue about until we define that.
I mean, libraries will be collecting basic data for library loans, for example, or to authenticate for use of online databases if the user wants to do that and things. I think that I'm just still concerned that what we're talking about here is the library's needs over the user's needs here. Whatever we end up deciding about opt-in or opt-out here, it's about what the user, it's about the user. We're not putting the user first, I think. I'm just really concerned about that statement.
And just a mechanics thing, we have a section around data sharing and use, which might be the more appropriate place for this particular topic.
Right. I admit my starting is encouraged. Okay. I encourage deletion of that statement, as it was admittedly Starkey, because I continue to feel that this is a view not be deleted. Please, enough said. Move on.
Yes.
Thank you. Go on.
Done. Issue closed. Next.
Go back up to UX.
Did we ever get the education UX? So can you read it out loud?
Sure. Systems are designed to telegraph the expectations users should have regarding their use of the system and their data. For example, avoiding patron surprise. And second bullet point, systems should be designed in a way that facilitate the understanding of choices and simplified management of options. Make it easy.
It strikes me as a little duplicative of what we have in transparency.
I think it errs on the UX side of it.
As I recall, I think Laura, when she was here, she was trying to get at the point that you can have transparency, but if you have a very long, small print, you know, so this is a slightly separate topic that gets at, you can't just be transparent with a 18-page, 8-point font document. You have to have it, make it easy to use.
I believe there were statements. I believe there were statements to that effect that ended up remaining in transparency and would need to be reconciled offline.
Unless this gets bulked out to include digital literacy education or something, I would put a note that maybe we move the UX stuff into the transparency section. Just put a note.
Yeah.
End the conversation. Okay. How we doing? Did we? Well.
We're opt-in, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
All right. What about these?
Sharon, I think Sharon's a critical one.
I'm going to scroll beyond the parties that we talked about.
Yeah.
Could I ask that in the parties section?
Within the parties section, the 2.5th is not potential. It is an actual, I mean, that's the world in which we live. And the word potential, I mean, that that complex interaction between the school library and the school, the academic library and the institution, the public library and the municipality, those are absolutely critical things.
The 2.5, the potential is referring to the terminology. Yeah, I don't know what, it has to be addressed.
Right. It's,
Yeah, I'm looking at the what comes after that. I understand number one. Number two, I don't understand at all. As example here, system analysis to determine future upgrades. What is the connection between that and personal information stored here? So why is it in here? If it's non-personal, I'm sorry, it doesn't get covered by this whole document.
This is the 3 tiers again.
I know, I don't understand the middle tier. Because especially if you look at the second example, personalization that is not obvious and not necessary for user intended function. That I understand. Personalization without something knowing about the person is obviously the second tier.
Yeah, so I don't know and I'll refine the text afterward, but the first tier is completely generic. The second tier has a little more attributability or a little more use in general recommendation or general more wide group analysis, but less attributable to an individual. And the top tier is fully attributable to a user and used for direct services for that user.
I still have a problem with the example. The example puts us in a problem that it says that we can't gather information from imagining the system. That's what it says.
So I must admit to being very confused about what the actual principle entails. What is so justification has something to do with the tiering, but what's the guiding principle?
There are varying levels of disclosure based on the type of content. There are varying levels of disclosure based on the level of detail and level of personal attributability in the data that's kept.
So it doesn't make much sense to me, but I mean, in the way that it's described.
Again, let's take the way that it's stated out of it and discuss at the conceptual level, and I can adjust the texting.
No, not just a particular text, just the overall. So there are various levels of disclosure.
Yeah.
And what are the factors that affect more how much you should disclose?
The level of attributability, of reverse attributability to an individual.
Okay, it doesn't say anything about that here. One, no, that says about the immediate operation of the service.
Right. This is described in its timeliness of use.
Not the identifiability of the person.
Yeah, this is described more in terms of its timeliness of use to the user, meaning if it's highly personalized, it's something that can be realized immediately versus more broad analysis. We'll find a better way to state this, or a different way to state it.
In other areas, sharing is often calibrated to the potential for harm and the ability to connect that data to an individual. You know, not strictly anonymous or not, but what's the potential for learning about an individual, some information, what harm can come from it, and you might want to tier on those bases, but as well as, I mean, it also seems like the clarity of the use is another one. You know, what's the benefit? And I think that's what these tiers are getting at. But harm, benefit, and identifiability might be some.
Yeah, and the identifiability is what it's going to now. But these are good points.
What she was getting at with the tiers. So is it giving me a personal experience, so, or is it kind of improving the product down the way?
I'm sorry, I'm going to come back again. If somebody clicks on a button on the screen, and on the server, it captures that the button was clicked. That's what's captured. Don't know who the person is. It doesn't capture who the person is, just who was clicked. Is this covered here or not?
Yeah, that's in the general use state.
So it also shouldn't be captured because it's personal and then being retained, be analyzed. No personal information, the fact that a button was clicked. You want to count. You want to prove the system. Button is not clicked. You should remove from the screen. This makes it more complicated.
But it is counted because at each of those 3 tiers, whether it's completely generic, somewhat attributable, or highly attributable, or it would fall into one of those categories. If it's not attributable, if it's just for general, metric purpose, again, it's about the intended use. If it's a general metric that the button was clicked and has no attributability, then it would go in the bottom tier. If it is that Shlomo clicked it, then it goes into the higher tier and is disclosed that we are tracking that it was clicked, by whom, and what it's used for.
I'm intrigued by the idea of providing some sort of categorization, but I like the idea in theory, but I'll have to kind of withhold until I see
and this is
what it looks like. I like the idea of trying to provide some sort of tiered system in order to try to get a handle on this, but this is, for now, it's a little...
So I think this tiered system of opt-in, opt-out is kind of half-baked. It needs a lot of work, and I would love to see it fleshed out, but it's so far from being usable at this point that I suggest that we somehow...
Could we simplify it, could we simplify this whole section by saying that there needs to be granularity in systems options and data tracking based on,
I think that's a speculative statement.
Especially when you add an opt-out.
But as far as a principle is concerned, with regard to opt-in and opt-out systems, there needs to be some level of granularity based on the specificity of the information and the specificity of the personally identifiable information that's related to that activity. So you just, instead of getting into a detail of the layers and the details, simply acknowledge that there needs to be some choices and some granularity in how the systems are developed based on that granularity need. Does that capture what that section was trying to discuss?
So if you try to design a real system, for example, adding lots of granularity can negatively impact user privacy. It can create fingerprints that can be used for tracking and things like that. So it's not, I like the idea, but it's just so far from being proven in practice, or that I don't think it has any place in a set of principles.
Also, the original document also had a chart with opt-out, opt-in, opt-out based on the 3 tiers, and that's gone here. I'm really happy that it's gone, because that's what I'm fighting about, is that you can't gather data to make your product better, even though it's completely anonymous, No matter what it is, sorry, you can't build your system to get better.
But
And I'm sorry, that's a big problem.
no, I agree with you, and by acknowledging that there is and needs to be nuance between, say, how much do we know about you and your behavior, and how much of that is we're tracking.
So, right.
So, no one's saying you can't collect information to make your product better.
Right now, that's what it says. But right now, with the chart, that's what it says. If you...
Here, sorry.
We all want the products to be better, so we want you to have the information you need to make the product better. And the question is there a model, and maybe this isn't the model, but that we can help clarify when a user needs to have an opt-out option?
I agree with that 100%.
Okay.
My problem is that, well, let me go the other way. When it has, let me one other 2 sentences. When it's in some way, you say data is being captured that is, you can attribute to a specific user, I'm 100% whatever goes. Opt in, opt out, delete, all of it. But if you capture it in a way which, again, it was clicked, and you don't capture who clicked it, when, okay, then it's not attributable, and then it comes into the same category. And so you're just making, you're causing, because it doesn't have anything here. It just says one general statement. I ask for what it means, and I'm telling, yes, it does mean that also. So we have to make it better.
Mike was first.
I agree we have to make it better, but I think we should park this and see if the group can come up with something different. I'd like to come back that this is the section on data sharing. One of our large concerns is how data is being shared with, I guess technically it's fourth party down the line. And so we don't have anything in here that's talking about who else is the data being shared with, unless I read it too quick. So this is an area about who is the data being shared with. Kind of the background is we've agreed that it's the library, the vendor. Who else is the vendor going to share the data with? So we need to have some clear guidance in here about how that is. Is it with user consent? Is it under what conditions can the vendor share this data with another party? So this is the section we need that type of language in. This is one of our primary concerns on the library side when we looked at this about the transparency and us not being sure what's going on. So this is, it's great to get into the option part, but this is the kind of the heart of one of the matters. This is kind of a crucial section that we're talking about here. And we don't address it at all right now.
And I think it's such a crucial point because I believe it also is being increasingly addressed in legislation, state level and potentially soon national level, regarding student data, where this fourth party sharing is absolutely being scrutinized to the highest degree, so much more than anything in terms of second party internal use for product development or business improvement. That I think we need to lighten up a little bit on that second party use and really be focusing on that nth party use where things are most potentially problematic.
How close are we to?
So on the privacy policies and practices, one component that I don't see is something around data use, a data use disclosure that the library could create the aggregate of the way the data for the services they subscribe to is used and provide that to the patron for clarity and transparency.
Sorry, do you want to just talk to me?
Yeah, maybe, I don't know. So this document, when we leave today, well, because here's what I'm thinking. It's late, we're tired, I'm not even sure what's in this document anymore, and I would really like a chance to look at it before we offer it as a draft.
No. I think.
So what?
I think where yes, given the time and given how much is in here and all of the editing and, actions, let's rewrite this section, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think what we will likely do, I think what we should do, what I propose that we do, is reconvene everyone in a kind of webinar environment sometime in late July. So give the steering committee some time to go back and clean this document up, bring it back to you all. It's a Google Doc, so you can also see it and look at it and edit it as well, or make comments on it. And
clean copy of this without
Maybe 1 or 2 meetings.
I'm sorry?
1 or 2 meetings. 1 meeting may not be enough. Future meetings.
Future meetings, possibly. Yeah, because I don't know how much of this, as we've been scrolling through the document, like you, I can only see what's on the screen.
And yeah, it's not even matching what I've got here.
And I think it would make sense for this community, this group, to collectively review a clean copy, have a meeting where we discuss that cleaned up copy, and if we need to have another meeting to agree on all the things that are in that cleaned up copy, then we'll have 2 meetings. Does that sound?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, because I'm wondering, do we need to keep going today, I guess, is where
Do we need to keep going today?
Part of that.
How much more do we have to do?
Quite a bit. There's a lot left.
So.
And I don't even.
Just page-wise.
We've got 3 pages.
So you've got 3 out of 8. So we have a third, and we've been going at this for over.
We have over an hour left at this rate.
Yeah, I mean, we've been doing this for 2 hours, so we have at least an hour. And I don't think we have an hour. So we could do this. Do we want to do this in 3 meetings? 1 to finish going through, 1 to review a cleaned up copy, and a third to, if necessary, finalize it? I mean, because if it's going to take, if finishing this document is going to take at least an hour, maybe 2, and then a kind of editing process so that we all agree on language, that'll take another hour at least, maybe 2.
Yeah, 3 meetings.
Also, out of respect for some of the people who had to leave early, like Laura
Yeah.
and Lisa, who were, such strong contributors and experts in the area, I like the idea of kind of tabling it for additional review later online, so that their great, sharing so far can continue.
I said yes.
Yes.
The ayes have it.
So, I mean, from my perspective, this was always ambitious. This is a huge and complicated issue. And we have 9 pages of principles. I was thinking, maybe like 10, 15 bullet list things. So we've got a lot more here than I was expecting we might end up with. So I think we've accomplished a lot. All right, so.
I will send out a doodle poll, probably tomorrow morning, 4 times later in July and early August. I ask your promptness in filling out the poll, and that will help us set times as early as possible so that people's calendars don't fill in. So look for that. Yeah.
No. I mean, there is a grant report deadline which is due to the Mellon Foundation like at the end of the year. And if necessary, I could even ask to that be extended. So, you know, I don't feel any external pressure to walk out the door here and say, hey, I would, yeah, as Shlomo, you just said, I would rather this get done well than fast. So, Nettie will send out a doodle, please respond. We'll convene at least 2 or maybe 3 meetings. Maybe if we don't need the third, we won't have the third. I'm guessing 2 hours?
I'll schedule 2 hours.
Schedule 2 hours.
Move the 2 hours, or people can, you know, we'll figure it out.
And we'll also send out the link to this document. We'll also, the steering committee will get together sometime before the meeting and go through some editorial process on this to clean it up. Let's see, what else? Any other follow-up?
Yes, Bobby.
I think I speak on behalf of everybody when I want to thank Nettie and Todd and the steering committee. I just happen to have the microphone.
No, thanks. This is a very interesting and energizing project, so I'm glad that everyone came and is so enthused.
Yes, and thank you all for coming and for your ideas and participation. It's been great. Thanks again to Mellon. For those of you who were supported in some way, work with Juliana on getting reimbursements. Let's see, what else?
If you think of anything.
If you think of anything, we will continue the list. You know, we've got the listserv, we've got the meetings. We'll continue this conversation. Thank you to whoever is still out there on the live stream. We'll be posting all of these recordings. You know, this entire meeting's been recorded, as you know. They're on the Ustream, the NISO Ustream account. We'll also link that from the page for this project. Yep. With that, thank you. Travel safely. I hope to see you all again sometime soon.